Well, welcome to another episode of The Economist Next Door, an economics podcast for everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of related topics about family formation, birth rates, and of course, something that's on everybody's minds, affordability, that we've been talking about a lot over the last few years with high levels of inflation and the housing crunch. Most people know that the world is complex, and that can make it hard to explain why things happen sometimes. So today I'm joined by our newest research fellow at AIER, Dr. Jeff Degner, as well as Aidan Grogan, who's our donor communications manager, but who's also working on a PhD in history at the moment and has done some work on the topics we're discussing about. And we're going to be talking through a handful of related issues that have been in the news and on people's minds: affordability and family formation. Birth rates have been declining around the world. Demographers say that an average birth rate, or what we'll be talking about, the fertility rate of 2.1 births per woman, is what we call replacement, meaning it will keep the population stable over time. Yet every developed country, with one exception, which we'll talk about, has dropped below that birth rate. In many countries, immigration has been supplementing the falling birth rates, but that comes with its own set of problems, and different countries have different ways of dealing with that. And then we'll turn to the U.S. specifically, and in the U.S., the U.S. is not the exception to the falling birth rate. U.S. birth rates have fallen below replacement, and so we're going to look at what can we see here in the United States. Part of the problem, and there's many pieces, and that's why we're going to have a conversation about this. High housing prices are a common concern, but people are also worried about the cost of food, the cost of electricity and water, the cost of vehicles, and many other things. And there's also concern, I think, among many people about what the future will hold when it comes to the economy or the political landscape or to environmental quality. And I think that makes many people a little more hesitant to have children, to get married, to form a family. So why are fertility rates in the U.S. falling, and can anything be done about it? That's what we're going to be speaking about today. Well, as I mentioned, I'm joined by Jeff Degner, our newest research fellow here. He's a senior research fellow on the Economic Freedom team, just joining us recently, and Aidan Grogan, who is our donor communications manager. And before we jump into the conversation, I just want to give each of them a chance to introduce themselves and a little bit about how they got interested in this topic or these related topics in particular and some of the work that they've done there. And then we will have a conversation about fertility rates here in the U.S. So, Jeff, why don't you go first? Why don't you tell us a little bit just about your interest in this area, how you got here, and anything else you want to share?
Well, Paul, thanks for having me. And I think the story of how I got here really starts with a line from a book called The Ethics of Money Production. And that was written by Guido Hulsmann, who turned out to be my PhD supervisor. I read his book back in 2010 or 2011, and there's a line in it that still sticks with me that really speaks to this issue. And that line is that inflation, fiat inflation, is a juggernaut of spiritual, economic, cultural, and social destruction. Very powerful line, but I think when it comes to the connection between an inflationary environment and what we see socially, culturally around the family, I think that is a powerful explanatory device for what's been happening, that inflation matters. And we can think of inflation in a couple of different ways, of course. Most folks are going to think of it as a general increase in prices, but there's also a more technical aspect on the monetary side where we see credit expansion and how this impacts how households, not just firms, right, but households live out their daily lives and make decisions. And so the connection between an inflationary world and these cultural changes have led myself and others to think of a phrase, the inflation culture, that this is an underlying root cause that has largely gone unidentified, unexplained when it comes to family change. Now, of course, we've got to be careful because, as you said from the top, this is a complex issue. There are many things at play, but the role that inflationism plays in it, I think, has been neglected. And so I want to bring that to the table for this discussion.
Great. Well, look forward. I already have questions. I look forward to following that up here soon. Aiden, why don't you share a little bit about kind of your interest in the topic and how you got here?
Sure. So I've long been interested in the history of Malthusian theory, eugenics, and efforts to limit population growth,
Mm-hmm.
especially in developing countries. And my dissertation chronicles that whole history. But since we have declining birth rates around the world, which is happening in both rich and poor countries alike, I've been really interested in kind of assessing the causes and consequences of that decline in fertility and writing a lot about it, especially as a Zoomer. My generation is going to inherit a world in which populations are rapidly aging and in many cases declining. And that's going to have enormous effects on Social Security, Medicare, and pensions. So the world is going to look a lot different in a few decades as population peaks and starts to decline. And it's not going to be just a gradual decline. It will most likely be a precipitous decline because if every woman on average is having just one kid, as is the case in East Asia, your population will go down very quickly in just the span of a couple of generations. So we're still very much used to thinking that there are too many people in the world and that this is going to have some environmental effects. But it's really time we start shifting our mentality to take into account that we're going to go down the mountain of population and have to readjust our economic systems, our political systems to account for that.
Yeah, great. Well, just to follow up here, you wrote an article last year about population control in China in particular. And of course, China's on a lot of people's minds. There's a big geopolitical rivalry going on. And I think, some people are aware of this, but many are not, that China has enormous demographic challenges and problems. So could you share just a little bit, maybe just high level, the kind of population control policies that were implemented in China and some of the effects we're seeing of that now, and what does it look like in China in, say, 20 or 30 years?
Sure. China implemented its draconian one-child policy in around 1980 or 1981 with the support of the United Nations Population Fund and international NGOs like the International Planned Parenthood Federation, who were pushing this Malthusian ideology in then developing countries like China. The consequences of that are currently manifesting. I mean, China overturned its one-child policy in 2016, but the fertility rate has not gone up. Surveys that were conducted of Chinese women after the one-child policy found that the average Chinese woman still just wants about one child. It wasn't just a policy change, but also a cultural and social change that occurred in China, but not just there, but also in other East Asian countries like South Korea, Japan. These countries also have very low fertility rates. So even if China didn't implement the one-child policy, it may still have followed the same pattern as South Korea, Japan, and other countries. And one thing that's interesting about East Asian cultures is they generally do not have children outside of marriage. Whereas in the United States, you have about 40% of kids who are born to mothers who are not married. In the East, they generally don't do that. They get married and then they have kids. And in the East, as in the West, and really in all developed countries now, the marriage rate has just declined as women get more educated and can work and have their own bank accounts and so forth. They're less dependent on marriage. They tend to get married later, and then subsequently they have fewer children.
That's interesting. Well, go ahead. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that. In the mid-2000s, I want to say, I strongly recall an Economist article that talked about one of the consequences of the one-child policy during the era where this was in operation. They committed what the economists called gendercide, with reference to abortion practices in China when only one child was allowed to be born per family. They selected young women or female fetuses out of family life. So the knock-on consequence of that years later is that in marriage markets, there is a massive difference in the number of available men versus available women. And one of the cultural practices in China is that families will pay a bride price. And this has meant that the only young men who are getting married are those who are already of means. And when you have a population of young men who are largely unattached, who may not have very good economic prospects and have no family attachment, this can lead to some real problems in terms of violence in society and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I've heard parts of that. I wonder if part of that, though, maybe played to their advantage in terms of men going into entrepreneurship and work. But maybe not. That might be more high.
Or the military?
Or the military, I've heard, and that may be part of it too. And I'd be curious to pursue that. And it's interesting to think about, we talk about income and wealth inequality here in the U.S. and that. And Aiden, I'm curious if you've seen this. Imagine if we had the imbalance between men and women here that we have that, because I still hear complaints, men talking about, Tinder apps and other things of, well, you have to be tall, you have to be wealthy. And so, Aiden, I don't know if you want to comment on, do we see men feeling dispossessed or dislocated here? I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues that could play in there. We don't need to go too far down that road, but I'm curious whether we see some of these kinds of dynamics of mismatches, whether it's education between men and women. There's been a big shift of that in the U.S. where women have continued to do well at higher education levels and graduate, and men have sort of been falling off as a percentage of the population. So maybe you can talk to what you've seen in that area.
We're certainly experiencing a mating and dating crisis in the United States as well as in other Western countries. Number one, young men and young women have drifted politically apart. Young women have become very left-wing in recent years, while young men have shifted a little bit to the right. Not too much, but definitely right of center. So that's causing some friction. Also, I think undoubtedly the introduction of social media and dating apps has created a kind of winner takes all situation. And many men complain that a small percentage of the men are getting all of the matches and the dates from the dating apps. And generally, there's far more men using these applications than women. So the gender ratio balance is skewed heavily in favor of women. So I think undoubtedly the culture of dating apps and social media is contributing to that mating and dating crisis. And we'll see if that's going to have an impact on fertility in the near future. I think it's a bit too early to tell right now.
Yeah, and I should have, I didn't even think about it because I read this book a little while ago. Maybe you're familiar with it, Jeff. I think it's called maybe Sex and Economics. But if not, I should get you a copy because it goes through just what you're talking about, the sort of game theoretic, the way these apps work is they reward a certain kind of woman, and then other women who don't want to engage in, shall we say, more promiscuous practices, find themselves at a significant disadvantage when it comes to the app. And there's just different ways in which those who are willing to can capture a lot of benefits in terms of being taken out to dinner and gifting. And so there's a lot of weird dynamics that have been created through these dating app markets.
There's a recent film that sort of reflects on this without the dating apps in the script. It's called The Materialists. If you might have seen this film, it really walks through some of the challenges where you have young men who might not have the best economic prospects. And not to be a spoiler for anybody who might want to see the film, you've got a typical starving artist is one of the men in the film. The other is a financier and is the proverbial 6 feet tall and is a millionaire and so forth. And the female protagonist is really torn between these two. But it's an illustration of what is happening in the dating and marriage markets, because the protagonist is actually a professional matchmaker.
Right.
And a lot of the film centers around what people are looking for.
Evaluating those qualities.
Exactly. One of the things I've tried to reflect on in some writing has been, what are the metrics of matching and how have they changed over time? You might think of past generations who maybe put similar values or religious components, religious metrics and beliefs at the fore of why they match. Maybe that has fallen down the list a little bit in comparison to things like income or income potential. Of course, that's not to say that income and provision hasn't always been important, but we see a changing mix of values and a changing priority of values that I think is symptomatic of the inflation culture. But we are seeing that unfold in real time. And as a happily married gentleman of 25 plus years now, I do have a lot of empathy for what I see happening among young people today. My own children are in the midst of that
Right.
world, and it's there are troubling aspects to it, but there are also points of hope where I think young people are recognizing that that they do want to be married. And I think for a generally conservative audience, we would recognize that marriage and family, these are some cornerstone pieces of a healthy, flourishing society. And so anything that we can do to encourage that, I think is fair game.
Right. Well, some of my friends and I, I've heard the joke that we kind of caught the last chopper out of Nam when it comes to the dating market, about 15 years ago. So it is a little bit bleak, though I think there are some bright spots. On the materials, I have seen that movie, and it probably isn't too much of a spoiler, but there's actually, I think, a very excellent message at the very end of the movie that I think might be easy to miss. But it actually, I think, plays into why many folks on the right are maybe misdiagnosing the importance of family. So you have, Vice President J.D. Vance or others who are like, well, we need more family formation, we need more birth rates, and the problem is that we've lost manufacturing jobs, the things are expensive, the economy's not very good, trade is a problem, and that's why family formation has declined. But what's interesting at the end of the materials is that the poorer guy who ends up getting the girl, he finishes by saying, you know what, I'm going to pick up an extra shift and I'm going to ask for a raise. And this is something that is, I think, a really important element that actually marriage can spur men on to achieve and to be successful, right? Because they have to provide, they have to deliver. And so losing marriage or having less family formation is kind of erodes that element versus occurred. And I thought that was actually very surprising to see in this, not political movie, kind of Hollywood movie, but it was very striking I was like, that's exactly right. That kind of, you need to do something with your life if you're going to get married and have kids. And it was really good, I think, to kind of finish the movie that way.
Yeah, it really did. It cut quickly at that point.
Yep.
And that was really good filmmaking in my view. But this points to something that economists have called the marriage premium, where historically people have looked and seen that once men become married, they tend to earn more. They become more productive in the labor market. Now, some folks have said, well, clearly, there you go. There's bias in the labor force and so on and so forth. But could it be the case that men actually step up their game when they become married and have that view on life that they're going to provide and so forth? Well, I think there's something to that. And so that is an interesting scene. I would call it a bright spot where it acknowledges that, again, it's an opportunity, especially when you're young, to step up professionally and to move towards a greater level of responsibility. So I know I experienced that.
Any thoughts on that before we shift?
I'd like to address what you mentioned about J.D. Vance and many on the news
Sure.
talking about market failure
Mm-hmm.
and attributing family breakdown to various economic factors, whether it's trade, etc. This mindset has inspired pronatal policies in various countries like Canada, Scandinavia, Asia, because it's the underlying assumption is that people are not having children because they can't afford it.
There's some financial reasons.
Right. And if you can just get the right incentives in place, then this problem will just simply heal itself, all of which can ostensibly be achieved through government policy. But what has undoubtedly happened in recent decades is there's just been a global transformation in social norms in regard to family and, in particular, what women consider the ideal family size. In the 1970s, when fertility preference surveys would be conducted, it was very common for women, especially in developing countries, to say, I'll have as many children as God wills. That they would provide non-numeric answers to fertility preference surveys. But in recent years, those types of answers have become almost non-existent. And according to the United Nations Population Fund survey released last year, the new global norm in both rich and poor countries and in various different cultures is just for 2 kids. People generally say they just want 2 kids. Some say they want 3 or more. Others say they want one or none, but two is generally the global average. And that reflects a massive shift in people's basic mentality toward family, children, marriage, etc. So you can't just attribute this all to economic factors. And I think it's important to also iterate that if people are just striving to have two kids, and you have any bit of a fertility gap where people don't achieve that ideal fertility, which is very common, then you're going to have a sub-replacement fertility rate and eventually a declining population if fertility doesn't go back up. And so I think many people are just striving for that two-child minimum and they're not reaching it, and that's why we're dealing with sub-replacement fertility.
That's right. So there's no compensation on the upper end of people having 4, 5, 6, 7 for those who don't get married or aren't able to have kids.
Right. Whereas in a country like Israel, the average Israeli woman wants to have between 3 and 4 kids, and the fertility rate is about 2.9. So there's a bit of a fertility gap there. But since they already want to have big families, they generally will still achieve that. Because the number one predictor of a country's fertility rate is the number of children that women say they want to have. It's human agency in the end, and it's not various economic factors. Although they may contribute, the number one factor is human agency.
Yeah, for listeners who didn't pick up on that, Israel is the exception I alluded to earlier, like the one developed country that still has, birth rates above 2.1 for its population. Well, I want to shift here. It's actually following up on what Aidan was talking about. So here's where things get complicated. So Jeff, coming to here. On the one hand, it seems obvious that prices matter, costliness matters, having children is expensive, houses. You alluded to inflation, having this kind of pressure. But I like what you said about inflation culture, that there's these cultural changes that come through inflation. So let's talk a little about some of those cultural changes maybe that we see. And then I have kind of a challenge for you, or a question, which is, you have some pretty wide variation in terms of inflation between countries. That's much greater than the variation in birth rates. So think about Argentina or other countries. And so I know you're not just saying it's like a 1-for-1 and there's much more complicated, but could you maybe tell a little bit about inflation culture and, how that relates to changing prices, how we see that in different countries, and how would you kind of build in the priciness, the costs in terms of how people think about children and family formation?
So one of the maybe wonky terms that gets used by economists is the time preference rate.
Okay.
And when individuals have a high time preference rate, that's a fancy way of saying that their thinking is short term. It's
less future oriented.
Yeah. And then the low time preference individual would have a longer time horizon. Well, this is an attitude that is carried by the individual, right? It's individual agency. And one of the ways that an inflationary environment can impact this is to drive us toward a higher time preference rate, towards more consumption, more short-termism, and so forth. But it's also the case that if you have a population who is wanting that short-term fix, they may go after policies and select politicians and policies that encourage that sort of behavior. So that's why, again, this phrase, the inflation culture, it is an awkward phrase, but it's, I think, an awkward acknowledgement that these things impact each other, the inflationary environment and the people in it. And sometimes you get what you ask for, and you get it good and hard, right?
Right.
And so some of the cultural effects, I do think, lend themselves towards short-termism in general, shorter time horizon, and having children. That is a long-term commitment, and it is an act of agency. I think the very fact that you have contraception being normalized throughout the West, contraception in different forms, we could point to that as maybe a spiritual problem. We could point to that as an ideological problem, but it could also be related to inflation, because if you've got people who are driven towards short-termism, then children really become an inconvenience. And so we might then develop the technologies or normalize the technologies that prevent having more children. And this fertility gap is such an interesting thing to take a deeper look at. When families, mothers, fathers state that they would like to have X number of children, but they only achieve a lower number, that's a real tough cookie to, that's a tough nut to crack right there.
Well, and I want to go to Aiden here in a second, but just to pull on that thread for a minute here, Tim Carney has written about this, and one of the things he talks about that I think is maybe related to this is he writes about how so many of our cities and our newer developments are kid unfriendly. There's not parks, crosswalks, it's not easy to bike, it's very car centric. And so one could imagine, and this would be interesting to kind of to pursue, ways in which higher time preferences lead to political decisions about who you support, political programs, which then have an impact on how we build streets and schools and parks and do other kinds of things, which then change the culture around children and families, family size. And having a large family myself, you run into circumstances where you say, this was not designed for someone with 6 kids, right? Like they're clearly not thinking about that when they design the car or the, whatever it is. So there's lots of ways in which this maybe time preference can then impact cultural development and infrastructure development, among other things.
Tim has talked about this, especially with Israel, right? It is a child-friendly environment, and so I think that's an interesting,
at least part of what's going on there.
The story,
Aiden, what do you think about it? Because I wanted to ask you about this too. That survey data is really interesting, and so what do you see as some of the reasons why there's this amazing shift in terms of how women think about having children or the number of children? Do you see some of this time preference or other kinds of cultural pressures? What's your sort of take on the shift we've seen?
What's interesting about fertility preference surveys is that people, the ideal States quite well, and she says it's not that American women don't want kids, it's just that they don't want them enough. And the problem with fertility preference surveys is they don't ask people what they're willing to give up to achieve their desired fertility.
Yep.
So they may say they want 2 kids or they may want 3 kids, but if they don't feel that they've reached a point in their life where they're comfortable having those children, or they really want to pursue that master's degree, or they want to continue going on those nice vacations, or they want to get a promotion or a better job, they might not be willing to make those sacrifices. However, as Catherine Bacalak shows in her book, Hannah's Children, women who are very religious, which there's about 5% of American women who are having 5 or more children, and they're the outliers. They are the exception. And so she interviewed about 55 women for her book who are mostly college educated but still having all these children, to figure out why are they so exceptional, why are they outliers, what motivates them. And in almost every single case, it was religious conviction. They were motivated by their faith to have a lot of kids. And so if there is that cultural or religious element influencing fertility behavior, that can overcome the opportunity cost. Whereas other people who don't share those convictions may have a more materialistic view and view children as more of a nuisance or an impediment to the other things that they want to accomplish. So the task is, how do you get people to see children as a blessing rather than as a burden?
That's sort of the ultimate low time preference, right? Is the eternal aspect, and thinking about legacy, thinking about grandchildren. And if you start early enough, I suppose you can think about great-grandchildren too. But that indeed is, I think, one of the features that you'll find among religious folks in general is a longer time horizon. Certainly the eternal, but a little more consideration. And as culturally the U.S. and much of the West drifts into what some have described as a post-Christian era, or however you want to describe that the general norms that maybe permeated society have been concentrated among smaller groups over time as well. And the messaging, the cultural messaging around children and family life has changed dramatically in recent decades.
Yeah, so I'll add a few of my experiences here, because I think there's a lot to that, but I'm just going to add some more wrinkles. in terms of what I've observed, and I'm looking forward to seeing your reaction to this, of thinking about how much variation there is in birth rates by part of the country that you're in. And so to set this up, I taught in New York City at a Christian college for a number of years, got to know many of the students well. My wife got to know many of the young ladies well. And there's sort of a vibrant community of alumni, especially a lot of alumna in the city. They have jobs, they're professionals, they're Christian, practicing Christians and care about that. But most of them have not gotten married. Most of them do not have kids, and they're, mid 20s, late 20s at this point. So like the time clock of later family formation is an issue. But it's interesting because they are religious and they are interested in children, but it's kind of what you were saying, Aiden, about, well, how much do you prioritize it? And they've got their community, which tends to be more female oriented, the church, but very feminine. And then New York City, ironically, as I've heard, I haven't experienced this, is a bit of a dating wasteland, which is very ironic given how many people there are. But I'll give this counterpoint. I have known, and this is anecdotal, but multiple women, not just one, multiple women who have moved out of the city, coupled to near where I live, and gotten married within a year or year and a half of moving out of the city.
Sounds like a Hallmark script.
That's right, it does. It's a pitch I make occasionally, but it's amazing how they, mid-20s, doing different things in the city or some other place, moving to kind of a more rural, working town, blue-collar town, and meet someone and get married really quick. And so there's that cultural piece as well. So I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that, what we see even for Christians in different cultural settings. The matching is challenging, the prioritization is challenging in a place like New York City or a high career-oriented place.
Well, I think a couple things there. In urban centers with such a bustling culture, so many people around, and I think there's a similarity to the dating apps here. It gives the appearance that that someone's out there, you just haven't found them yet. You haven't had the time to sort through the mass, the pool. And when you move to a smaller location, maybe your firm is smaller, your church is smaller, and you actually get a little more face time, not in the technological sense, but real face time with people to get to know them. This is a pretty good recipe, and a recipe for family formation. One state in particular, you brought up the geography that I found interesting, and it brings the economics back to the fore, is the state of Utah. There are two things happening in Utah. They have the lowest cost to achieve a college education, and they have the youngest age at first marriage in the union. That pairing of statistics kind of struck me a little while ago, that the affordability issue in higher education and the debt loads that young people bring into the picture, this causes a little bit of hesitation and later marriage. So I think, again, the economics are there, but also the cultural realities of being in a place where you can get more personal contact with people. That's those two things together, I think, are important: affordability and proximity.
Yeah, it's interesting about like the sorting through or not sorting through the options there. Well, to build on this, and I want to go back to you. We talked about how a lot of pronatal policies don't work at all, or very, very briefly. So think about giving extra money to women for having children, or large child tax credits. What do we do in terms of ways to approach it? Does it need to be a more organic cultural change? Does it need to be more of a systemic economic change, or are there political dimensions? I'm curious, having spent a lot of time with this, what do you see as things that could be done or should be done, whether at a political level or maybe not at a political level, to address the issues of family formation and childbearing?
So I think we're very limited in what we can do at the governmental level.
Sure.
Of course, we want to bring down the cost of housing, we want to control inflation and so forth to make it. It is a big problem right now. But even if that is achieved, you still have the problem of opportunity costs and the cultural shift away from pro-family and pro-natal attitudes, and that cannot come from government. And rich women tend to have fewer children than poor women. So that kind of defeats the whole affordability argument.
Doesn't seem to be economics related.
And also Melissa Kearney and did a study where they looked at fertility patterns in the U.S. on a state-by-state basis to see where fertility went down the most or where it dropped the most significantly. And they found that there was no correlation between declining fertility and cost of living increases. So it has everything to do with people's mentality and not as much with cost of living, housing, etc., as we would think. Now that they may be influential in a certain way, and of course we should try to bring the cost of living down and really prioritize that. But that's not going to be a solution, nor are the various pronatal policies that countries like Poland or Hungary or Scandinavian countries have implemented. At best, that can just lead to a very marginal increase in fertility. In some cases, they don't bring about any increase in fertility. And again, it's because the assumptions behind it, the presuppositions, are misguided.
I think, yeah, and maybe to push back a little bit here, I might call what you described there, I might call it the Keynesian curse. Keynes, of course, had the infamous line that, well, inflation doesn't matter because in the long run, we're all dead. Well, that to me speaks to a cultural, personal attitude around the future. And it does then speak to family life. Children are a long-term investment, so why make it? Right? They are costly in a sense of dollars and cents, but also in terms of time and the trade-offs involved. And so I think when you're living in a culture that is that fast-paced, materialistic, consumeristic sort of society, I would want to dig down to how did we get there? I think that the inflation culture provides part of that answer, but it's only part. And cultural messaging from all areas of society, whether it's Hollywood and the media, these impact how young people think about marriage and family life. And I think that's why we see those non-correlations that you described, that there are these cultural elements that have sort of been embedded into our world.
Well, and I'll throw this at you, see what you think. I wonder if we economists are not partially to blame here. Gary Becker's work about children as durable goods or investments, even that language, right. I understand. But what's ironic, I'm an economist, but what's funny is I never thought about, okay, how expensive will it be to have another child? I never did the calculus of, okay, what am I going to spend over the course of their life? But people do this in a lot of places. They're like, well, what can we afford? Can we put them in the school? Especially upper income folks that think about children in terms of more of an investment. So I wonder, it's not like economists are saying, maybe Becker might say this, like you should think about your children in a monetary sense, but it's almost, that's the difference where Aiden was saying, people say, well, whatever children God gives me, totally different from, well, 2 or 3, or like, what am I going to do with the car, or what are we going to do but a lot of people, it's funny because I'm more of the former, even though I'm an economist and not counting the dollars and cents. But anyway, Jeff, I'm curious what you think. Are we to blame as economists for sort of quantifying things that maybe quantifying is not a very helpful thing to do when it comes to deciding?
It's interesting. Joseph Schumpeter, back in 1942, in his book Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, has a section there where he talks about what he calls the evolution of capitalism, which is really interventionism, spiraling out of control. But he says that at a point, people will begin to adopt more of a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis on everything they do, and just deem children to be too costly, not in a strict accounting sense, but more to use a modern bit of lingo here. The vibe is that children are, that's going to be costly. I'm going to lose sleep. I'm not going to have that promotion, et cetera, whatever the cost is. But so I think Schumpeter was onto something. Now, I think that he didn't go far enough to identify the causes of it. And that's why I've brought forward my work and try to give an explanation for the causes of that shift in mentality, especially around children, where I think the language, Aiden, to your point, maybe in the early part of the 20th century, certainly in the 1900s, Americans, by and large, would have said children are a blessing. I think now most folks would say children are a burden, but not all.
Not all of them, and this is maybe where I'll give another anecdote that impacted me a little bit, and I find fascinating. I had a professor at George Mason named Brian Kaplan, who is well known. He's eclectic, a lot of great ideas, interesting things that he says. But I remember he's not religious as far as I know. But I remember chatting with him, and he had written a book called "Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids." And in that book, he doesn't do the dollars and cents thing, but he does survey data. And it's a very simple argument where he says, well, when you survey people as they get older, you find out that they almost always wish they had more kids or maybe regret not having kids. And he describes it as a part of the challenge is that we overestimate the cost of children in a broad sense, right? As you were saying,
Right.
Time, effort, opportunity. We overestimate that on the front end, and we don't really have a good way to know how much we'll appreciate and value and benefit from them on the other hand. And so if there's not a religious reason or kind of a faith or a commitment, people are going to have fewer kids than maybe they want to, and certainly fewer kids than they will wish that they had down the road. And he practices what he preaches. He has 4 kids, which is unusual for a professor. He's married, I think, to a lawyer. And I read, I'm like, that's a good argument. Like that makes sense to me. And it explains this kind of disconnect that we see, where on the front end it's scary, it's uncertain, and you don't really know what it's like, and so you really have an immediate view of the costs,
Yeah.
and only kind of a vague sense of the benefits. Especially if, and this is something else we haven't talked about, if we see people are not living with their grandparents as much as they used to, or their parents, and as we see the nuclear family shrink and we see extended families scatter,
Yeah.
I think that was in the past a way that people kind of knew implicitly there's a lot of value and beauty to this. A lot of people don't experience it as much anymore. So, Aiden, any thought on that? Or
Yeah. When consistently people are having fewer and fewer children, that's going to affect their social capital over time, because they're going to have fewer aunts and uncles, fewer siblings, fewer cousins, and these are people that you would historically rely on when times get tough to kind of give you some assistance if you lost a job or something like that. I think increasingly people are going to become more dependent on government as that social capital continues to break down, because people are not having children. And then this problem just gets exponentially worse, because with fewer children being born, you have fewer people who are going to be working and paying taxes to support a big government that's going to be providing welfare and entitlements and everything to take care of an increasingly atomized population that doesn't have the networks of social capital to help them out.
Great point.
One of the things that came to mind here as well was a book called Love, Parenting, and Economics by Depke and Zilbati there, I believe out of Northwestern. And in it, they describe high income earning couples and what they described as intensive parenting. This is the kind of parenting where we are. It used to be in the early 2000s. I think it was the baby Einstein, right? As soon as your kids are out of the womb, you put them in front of baby Einstein, and we're doing piano lessons,
Music,
violin lessons. We're doing all the things, right? And indeed, that's very costly, but it also reflects an attitude among parents, and Zobati and Depke point this out, is that these high achieving parents recognize that in a very competitive and inflationary economy, you've got to bust your tail to make it. And so we're going to put that investment, I'm using air quotes here, investment into your children to ensure that they get into the best prep schools, the best universities, so that they've got the ability to make it, at least by that pair of parents' standards. Well, that's a very different mindset than what some folks have described as sort of free range parenting, or the idea that when you have more children, that the older ones helped raise the younger ones. And there's a beauty that gets lost. We call it social capital, but it's networks of cooperation that are founded or really generated out of family ties. What's the substitute for that? As you said, Aiden, we've got to find ties elsewhere in order to make it through tough times. And government is there to step in as Big Daddy or big, the nanny state, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the conundrum we find ourselves in, and it's not going to be an easy fix or a direct fix, but that's part of why understanding the problem is so important. Well, thank you, gentlemen. There's so much more we could do. You mentioned free range parenting. We talked about tiger moms, talked about Jonathan Haidt. So we may have to do this again sometime. So it was fun. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate your time.